We are Maike Rotzoll, Professor Dr. Maike Rotzoll, a medical historian who teaches at Marburg University, and I'm Dr. Thomas Röske. I'm the director of the Prinzhorn Collection in Heidelberg. We both are the curators of this show, which is called People Who Still Could Have Lived. And we talk about this exhibition now and introduce the topic. It's an exhibition in the Prinzhorn Collection. The Prinzhorn Collection is a museum which belongs to the University Hospital in Heidelberg. It's a museum which is famous for its historical collection, which was put together mainly by an art historian and doctor called Hans Prinzhorn, who was here from 1919 to 1921, and who had the idea to send out an appeal to all psychiatric hospitals, mainly in German-speaking countries, to ask for artistic works by patients to build up a museum for pathological art. Part of his contract was to publish a study about the collection, which was called Artistry of the Mentally Ill, Bildnerei der Geisteskranken, which was published in 1922. And he left in 1921 already. The collection developed a little bit. It was misused by the National Socialists as comparative material for the infamous exhibition Degenerate Art, which toured Germany from 1937 to 1941. Then it was forgotten. It was rediscovered in the 60s, but it is only a museum now from 2001. And we do regular special exhibitions. This is one of it. And we'll just talk about the topic of this exhibition and introduce some of the artists which are represented in this show. People Who Still Could Have Lived, we called our exhibition. It's an exhibition about victims of National Socialist crimes in the Prinzhorn Collection. It was not the first exhibition we did on that topic. There was one already in 2002, which commemorated victims of the euthanasia program. At least those 21 victims of whom we knew at that time. This information commemorates those artists. For each artist we have here one image of one of their works. Now we did another exhibition. Why did we do another exhibition on this topic?
Yes, because research has gone on. Our colleague Sabine Hohnholz, who worked here in the archives of the Prinzhorn collection of this museum, she found out about many other victims. She found out about other euthanasia victims. She found out about victims of forced sterilization, but also about victims from concentration camps. 3 victims from concentration camps who partly were also murdered in these camps. And then one oeuvre came to the collection of a Jewish philologist, Hannah Hellman, who is especially important to us because she was a Jewish psychiatric patient from the mid of the 30s. And she was a victim of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, because she was transported with all the other patients of a special asylum for Jewish patients at Bendorf-Sein. They were all transported to the east, and Hannah Hellman was murdered in Sobibor. It was a camp of the so-called Action Reinhardt, and these were 3 camps, Sobibor, Belzec and Treblinka, where about 1.5 million Jewish people, Sinti and Roma, and also some psychiatric patients were murdered on arriving. Mm-hmm. It was not a concentration camp, but it was only an extermination camp, so before, like the other camps of the Reinhardt action.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk about the patient groups or the victim groups one by one. And maybe we talk a little bit about the euthanasia victims. There are 15 new ones we have identified in the collection. And what can you say in general about them and their fate?
Yes, I can first say that there were different so-called euthanasia actions, and we have in our collection, we have victims of centralized euthanasia, and we have also victims of decentralized euthanasia. Centralized euthanasia was not only T4 action, but we have only victims of T4 action because our victims were adult when they were murdered. Another example for centralized patient murder was the so-called children's euthanasia. But we have no children in this collection. We have drawings of children, but who were children before, long time before they were murdered. So for the centralized patient murder, we have only adult persons. And this is no wonder because the patients who contributed to the Prinzhorn collection around 1920 afterwards kept to stay in their asylums, and when the euthanasia began in 1939, 1940, they were old and they were judged as useless people, as useless eaters. So they were in a great danger to be murdered. I could tell a little bit about the organization of the centralized T4 patient murder. It was planned, as I said before, in the summer of 1939, and with the beginning of the war, so-called registration forms were sent to asylums, and the physicians, the psychiatrists in the asylums had to send these registration forms filled in to the central office of the T4. T4 is for Tiergartenstraße 4, an address in Berlin where this central building was, and the organization center with about 300 people working there was located.
So that's now close to the Philharmonia.
Yes,
in Berlin. Yes.
Yes, it's close to the Philharmonia, and there's also an open-air exhibition on our topic there near to the Philharmonic. Yes, the registration forms were sent there. Then transport lists were sent to the asylums, and then buses came to the asylums and took about 75 patients with 3 buses to the extermination centers. There were 6 extermination centers during the war, not all at the same time in function. It began with Brandenburg, for example, and with Grafeneck, here nearby in southwest. But afterwards there were other extermination centers in Pirna Sonnenstein, near Dresda, or Bernburg, Hartheim near Linz in Austria, and also Hadamar in Hesse. And in these buildings there were gas chambers that were disguised as bathrooms. So the patients should not know before their death that they were going to be killed there. So the buses transported these patients to the extermination centers, or later on also to intermediate centers before, to make the logistics even better. And then the patients were murdered at the same day they were transported to these extermination centers. So that was T4 action. There's much more to say about T4 action, but if you like, you can also ask about it. But I would continue with decentralized patient murder. Often it is thought to begin only after T4 action. this is not true. It began also with more or less with the war. Even before the war, there were austerity measures in the asylums. There were more patients in the same space. The food rations were lower than normally and got always down. There was less personnel, but the mortality did not rise so much before the war. But with the beginning of the war, the mortality began to rise. There were patients who died because of starvation also before 1941. But after the end of the T4 action, these decentralized patients' murders were intensified. So more and more patients died. There was a radicalization, we could say. And the patients were also not only murdered by starvation and by neglect, but also with overdoses of medication. Mm-hmm. And there were also some asylums like Hadamar again, but also Meseritz-Oberwalde in Brandenburg, in the east of Brandenburg, today in Poland, and also Großschweidnitz, also in the east, which had a function, not only local function, but more than regional function in this decentralized patient murders. That means that also patients from very far, from the Rhineland or from Hamburg, were transported to these asylums in the east, to Meseritz-Oberwalde, for example, because during the war they were taking measures for the case of bombing of the cities. So patients of civil hospitals should be evacuated from the center of the cities to psychiatric asylums nearby, because they were deemed more worthful than the psychiatric patients. And the psychiatric patients were transported very far away and were murdered in these institutions in the east. This is also the case of Otto Ohlmann, one of our patient artists. He lived in Hamburg, in Langenhorn, in an asylum for about 30 years. And then in 1943, he was transported to Meseritz-Oberwalde. But before the bombing, the so-called Action Gomorrah that hit Hamburg in July, he was transported to Meseritz-Oberwalde in May, and only about 3 weeks after, he died there. So he is clearly a victim of decentralized patient murder.
Another group of victims here in the exhibition are victims of the forced sterilization program. Is there a connection between this forced sterilization and the killing in the euthanasia program? Is the killing a kind of radicalization of the sterilization?
Yes, it can be seen as in this way, but there are also differences, of course. Forced sterilization is a measure of eugenics. Eugenics was a widespread movement, an international movement also, beginning in the late 19th century, and there were sterilization laws in different countries in the world, beginning with Indiana in the USA in 1907, but also in Switzerland, in Scandinavia, in the Baltics, and it was discussed also within the German Reich during the Weimar Republic, when eugenics had developed and was an acknowledged science. It was a social movement, but also developed as a science and was renowned at that point. Sterilization was discussed, and there was prepared a sterilization law, but that would have been voluntary sterilization. yes, it remained there. It was made in 1932, but nothing happened. But when the National Socialist regime began, it was one of the first laws the regime took and debated, and it went into force in 1934. And it differed from the law that was debated before, because there was very intense force within this law, and so on the law of hereditarily diseased offspring was decided in 1933, and the law was put in force in January 1934. And during the National Socialist era, about 350,000 up to 400,000 people, men and women, but also children, more or less, were sterilized. Many women died, about 5,000 women died of the operation, and also several hundred men, and an unknown number of people committed suicide because of this. Because you asked if there were connections between euthanasia and sterilization, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was directed against persons with a psychiatric diagnosis, so feeble-mindedness or also schizophrenia, or epilepsy, and some other diagnoses, but against those of them who could live in the society, for example, were released from the institutions, or could get out of the institutions, could get in holidays or worked outside the institutions, so who had more radius in society, not the severe cases, as it was said then, because these persons were said to have more possibility to progenerate, to have children. So it was directed against them. While euthanasia actions were directed against people who were in asylums and had not so much possibility to have children, because the asylums were divided in a part for men and a part for women. And you see many victims of euthanasia had also had children before, were very old women with the age over 50 who could not have any more children, or it was directed also against patients who had no illness that was seen as hereditary, so for example syphilis, or it was also directed against patients who were already sterilized. So you can see that euthanasia is not primarily a eugenic measure. I think this is important. So there are links between eugenics and euthanasia, because both actions should reduce the costs to society, but sterilization in the future, because the people deemed not worthy for the society should not have children, and euthanasia directly, because the perpetrators wanted to use the food, they wanted to use the room of the asylums, and they also wanted to use the personnel of the asylums in another way and not for the patients. So it was a question of resources, and this was ever more important during the war, of course. Mm-hmm. So there are links between these two actions, but there are also differences. Mm-hmm.
So you talked already about Hannah Hellmann, who became a victim of the extermination camp in, where was it?
In Sobibor.
In Sobibor. And she was killed because she was Jewish, so she was a victim of the Shoah. But we also have some victims of concentration camps. how is it possible that people who were mentally ill were in a concentration camp where usually just prisoners were kept?
These three men who are artists of the Prinzhorn Collection were as antisocial persons or as
minor criminals.
Minor criminals. They were in the concentration camps, but they all had a kind of patient career before. Mostly they oscillated between several types of institutions. This happened often because, for example, beggars or vagrants were put sometimes in prisons or in workhouses, and sometimes they were also diagnosed as schizophrenic, and they were put in psychiatric institutions. And our three patient artists have such fates. Sometimes they were in prisons, sometimes they were in workhouses, sometimes they were in psychiatric institutions. So, and this kind of life they conducted over some decades. And at the end, those three were interned in concentration camps. So Ludwig Berthold, for example, he was interned first in an early concentration camp, because concentration camps were introduced in Nazi Germany beginning in 1933, and these first concentration camps are also called wild concentration camps. And he was put in such a concentration camp in Kislau for a brief time, and then he went back to the road and to prisons and so on. And then at the end he was interned in Struthof-Natzweiler, which is a concentration camp in annexed Alsace, and afterwards in Dachau. Dachau is a famous concentration camp near Munich. One of the main camps, one of the 20 main camps, which had also a lot of exterior camps. And when Germany was liberated, he was in one of those external camps in Kempten, it was called, and so he was also liberated, and we know nothing about his fate afterwards, but we know that he was not murdered in Dachau.
Whereas the other two artists who are presented here in the exhibition, who were inmates of concentration camps, died there as well. So
yes, Peter Mikolajewski, he was in Sachsenhausen, and he was also then in Dachau, and he died in Dachau. The third one, Karl Krumpak, we are not absolutely sure that he died, but it is very probable that he died in a concentration camp.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction into the topic of the exhibition.
Oh, you're welcome.
Friederlose Wächter is of special importance for this exhibition, also because the title of the show is derived from the writing on one of her drawings, which she did in 1933. She was concerned with making portraits and studies after fellow patients in Arnsdorf Asylum, where she was interned from 1932. And the writing does not so much mean, and cannot so much mean, that these people were already physically dead, but it meant that those people were already forgotten and dead for society. So they were dead before they were killed, and some of them definitely were also exterminated in the so-called euthanasia program, like herself. She was a professional artist. She was born in 1899 in Dresden, and she grew up in the surroundings of Felix Müller and Otto Dix and other Dresden artists of that period, but she was never very lucky as an artist, as a woman artist, and mostly made money with arts and crafts projects, not so much with her proper art drawings and painting. She was first interned in a psychiatric hospital in 1929 for several months because she had had a nervous breakdown after marital problems with her husband and because of the poor conditions under which she had to live. She was relieved again, and she led her life as an artist, or tried at least, but she became more and more poor, and finally she had to go back to Dresden to her parents.
But before she had this exhibition of the heads of Friedrichsberg of drawings of her fellow patients.
That was her first little success, you could say. This exhibition in 1929, short after she had left the asylum.
Yeah.
But unfortunately it didn't continue that way, and as I said, she had to go back to her parents, and then there was a little incident as a doctor's visit. I think you know more about that.
Yes, she had to go to a doctor because of some minor problem, and I think she went there with her father or with her mother, I don't remember exactly. But the important thing is that the doctor had the impression she was nervous, and so she was institutionalized then in the Arnsdorf asylum. And this was in 1932. Her husband divorced from her, and so she was forcibly sterilized then in the asylum, and the parents couldn't do anything about that.
Which means this divorce was responsible for her being put into a position out of which the parents couldn't help her anymore?
Yes, because this other person had to decide on her. To be sterilized, and the parents didn't want that, but
and she didn't want that
and
either.
She didn't. Of course, she also didn't want that, but it happened.
Okay, and before that, she did a lot of portraits and studies after the fellow patients, as I said. In 1935, probably this little drawing was done. Which shows a kind of ornamental body of a woman with big breasts and flowing hair, and it seems quite elegant even, but the thing which is really irritating is a hole in the body, and that's exactly in the middle of the womb, so it seems to be quite clear that it is a commentary about the forcibly sterilization. And afterwards, it seems that she only did studies of plants. Maybe it's not too sad and not a kind of sign of giving up, but she was looking at other signs of life, you could say. I think she still had hopes that she could leave the hospital and maybe resume her career as an artist. But some of the drawings are quite sad. Some of them are little postcards she sent to her parents, mostly with encouraging messages that they shouldn't lose hope and so on. But unfortunately, she is one of the examples of people who were forcibly sterilized and then also became victims of the euthanasia program.
Yes. She's one of these examples, and she lived in Arnsdorf. She was on holiday at her parents' home, and they were in close contact with her. That didn't help her, and she was transported then to Pirna Sonnenstein, and she was murdered there.
In 1940
in
already.
1940.
Another interesting artist in our exhibition is Wilhelm Müller. Unfortunately, we do not know much about his biography because the medical file is lost, but he has written a lot on his drawings, and we have a lot of his drawings and watercolors. In fact, it's a quite big oeuvre. Why do you think he is especially interesting for this exhibition?
I think his drawings, his small paintings are a very good possibility to have an impression of asylum life. Because he was institutionalized in 1907 in an asylum in the north of Germany, Domjüch, it's near a lake. And
Neustrelitz.
Neustrelitz, it's in front of a lake called also Domjüchsee, Lake Domjüch, and Wilhelm Müller, from his position in his room in the asylum, depicted always the same view on the lake with the same tree. You can see here. He painted more than 40 paintings of this only motif, with different colors, in different seasons, in different times of the day, and so you get an impression that he was always in this room for many years, from 1907 until his death in Bernburg in 1941. His drawings are from before 1920, obviously, because they were sent to Prinzhorn, to the Prinzhorn Collection, but he will have lived afterwards the rest of his 20 years remaining, also in the Domjüch Asylum. And
it's well possible that he went on making these watercolors and drawings of the same view.
Yes, and if not, sitting there and looking at the lake and having always the same impression for many, many years. And so you can imagine how asylum life was in this period of time.
How do we know when and where he was killed?
There's a certificate of his birth. It's the only document showing that he died in Bernburg, because it is written on the document, died in Bernburg in a certain date, and this date is about 2 or 3 weeks later than the only transport from patients from Domjüch, from his asylum, to Bernburg. And this was a kind of praxis in the T4 action, that the death certificate was made some weeks later, so that the money for the asylum came to T4 action. So
they still profited from the money,
yes,
which was given for the patient, although he was already dead.
Yes, this was very often the case.
Okay.
And for Jewish patients, or even more time, like half a year, for example. Yeah. These are the drawings of Otto Ullmann, who was a victim of decentralized euthanasia. He lived in Hamburg Langenhorn Asylum from 1914 onwards until 1943, and he left these small drawings on toilet paper. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Yeah, unfortunately we do not know much about the context, but it's quite obvious that he used this special kind of toilet paper, which is semi-transparent, to produce certain effects. With the other side of the drawing is shining through, and there is a kind of mixture of the two drawings, and he seems to play with it. And this is made possible also through the fact that the figures he's drawing are quite stereotyped in their character. They're all male figures in quite high collars and big jackets. But the most obvious feature is that they have very clear-cut hair and kind of robust male-looking appearance, as if they were kind of mannequins for a hair cutter in his time.
Yes, he was a hairdresser's assistant. Yes. It was his profession. So
I think it has to do with his profession, and we have a lot of examples in the Prinzhorn collection that people stayed in contact with what they knew and what they did before they were put into an asylum, and I think this is a perfect example for that. Now we are on the gallery where we show first people who were forcibly sterilized, and Theodor Wagemann is one of them.
Yes, he was born 1918 and he lived with his family, but in 1933 he got a psychiatric diagnosis. But he never was in an asylum during National Socialism. He continued to stay with his family, but he was forcibly sterilized during this time. And after the war, he was institutionalized, and he lived in several different facilities, and began to draw only late in his life.
Yes, and we have his late drawings here in the exhibition. We do not know if there are any earlier drawings. He must have had some routine in drawings, but the drawings we have are only from the 80s, and he died already in the 90s. But he was very productive, and there was somebody who collected his drawings and also cared for that special museums got some examples of his. And we were one of the lucky institutions whom he thought about. Strange fact is that Theodor Wagemann made drawings especially of people who were big party members of the National Socialist Party, especially Adolf Hitler. It's said that he made more than 800 portraits of Adolf Hitler, whom he always called Adolf Hitler, and this kind of caricature of the name seems to be reflected in the way he makes the drawings. It looks more like a caricature of Hitler, but the writings around it seem to indicate that he was celebrating these politicians, which is irritating because he nearly became a victim of the National Socialists. But I found that the features of his face, of this face and of other faces of people he made drawings of, resemble mostly his own face. So you could say he's a kind of parallel to Cindy Sherman, seemed to identify with mighty figures of history, and also with those mighty figures whom he nearly became a victim of. This is one of the two works the Prinzhorn Collection owns by Ludwig Berthold, whom we mentioned as one of the victims of a concentration camp. It's a very impressive image of a raised hand with an eye on one of the fingertips. It's quite mysterious. We do not know what exactly it means, but it's very intense, and it sticks in your mind as maybe the hand of somebody who suffered a lot in psychiatric hospitals and prisons and the concentration camp.
We come back to the only victim in this exhibition of an extermination camp, in her case of Sobibor, to Hannah Hellmann, the Jewish philologist. In this glass case there are some of her flower pictures, her drawings of flowers. She made more of them. She made 1,855 of them during her stay in psychiatry, and she sent them to her family to keep up the contact with them, to donate them something colorful, something full of joy, full of life, and even in a period very difficult for the Jewish people in Germany from 1939 to 1942. So these pictures, these color pictures of Hannah Hellmann, are especially important to us and to this exhibition.